Greetings, this is Greg. I want to talk about the P-47 Thunderbolts operations in the Pacific Theater during World War II. I'm going to put quite a bit of focus on drop tanks and range. Without the right drop tank, the Thunderbolt could not have been a meaningful participant in the Pacific Theater, thus it's a big part of the story. In December of 1941, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, 14 U.S. B-17s escaped and flew to Australia. As these were the only aircraft of the Far Eastern Air Forces to escape, that made Australia the location of the headquarters of the Far Eastern Air Forces, which were then reorganized into the U.S. 5th Air Force in February of 1942. The 5th Air Force needed a leader, and General Douglas MacArthur was given a choice of two generals. One was General Jimmy Doolittle, the other was General George Kenney. When I first heard that, I thought, how could anyone not choose Jimmy Doolittle? He was at this time one of the most famous pilots in the world. He was a famous air race pilot, had just led the Doolittle raid. He was a huge part of the development of high-octane fuels. He pioneered instrument flying. He's Jimmy Doolittle. Yet MacArthur chose George Kenney. I can't claim to know for sure what he was thinking, but I think I get it. Hear me out on this. General MacArthur was generally quite critical of the Army Air Force. He thought they overpromised and underdelivered. General Kenney was sort of an outcast in the Army Air Force. Now, he was an accomplished pilot. He flew in the First World War. He and his gunner even had 2 air-to-air kills flying the Salmson 2A2, which is a biplane. It sort of looks like a giant SPAD 13, but it's powered by, of all things, a liquid-cooled radial engine. Why build a liquid-cooled radial? You're combining almost all the drawbacks of an air-cooled radial with almost all of the drawbacks of a liquid-cooled engine. Anyway, back to our story. Kenney was also highly involved in training fighter pilots to fly the P-38 Lightning, so he was very familiar with that airplane and was absolutely an expert on its capabilities. However, I don't think he was chosen by MacArthur for his aviation background. You see, Kenney had run afoul of the bomber mafia on a number of occasions. This resulted in his transfer to an infantry school where he taught infantry tactics. Remember, the USAAF was still a part of the Army. General Kenney was also involved in studies and wrote reports during the interwar period for War Plan Orange, which dealt with tactics and strategies the U.S. should use in the event of a war with Japan. I think Kenney was chosen not because of his aviation background, but because of his time teaching infantry tactics and working on War Plan Orange. That said, General Kenney was a very competent aviator and technically knowledgeable. That would matter when he was given orders in July of 1942 to take command of the 5th Air Force. Kenney needed fighter planes. He wanted P-38 Lightnings. We're up to about March of 1943 at this point. The problem was that every theater commander wanted P-38 Lightnings. At this point, the P-38 was thought of as America's premier fighter plane, and everything else was just sort of an also-ran. There just weren't enough of these things to go around, so General Kenney accepted that one of his fighter groups would have to be equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts, which in his words, quote, nobody else wanted, unquote. Those P-47s arrived in Brisbane, Australia on June 20th of 1943, with the commander for the new P-47 fighter group, a Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby. The planes came partially disassembled. They towed the planes to a place called Eagle Farms near Brisbane for final assembly and preparation. All of this is documented, by the way, in General Kenney's book, General Kenney Reports, first published in 1949, so it's out of copyright and thus can be found in my Patreon section in PDF form. It's 594 pages of amazing Pacific Theater information. Back to our story. General Kenney went out to Eagle Farms to see his brand new Thunderbolts and discovered they had not been shipped with drop tanks. This was a big problem. These Thunderbolts, with 305 gallons of internal fuel, the normal amount at the time, with no drop tanks, just didn't have enough range to be used in the Pacific Theater. In fact, without drop tanks, just getting them from Brisbane to their base in New Guinea was going to be a huge problem. Now, Republic had designed 3 drop tanks for the P-47, a pair of 200-gallon tanks, one being made out of metal and one of compressed paper, and a 650-gallon tank. The 200-gallon metal tank and the 650 are mentioned in this document. As far as I know, the 650 was never built, but the pair of 200-gallon tanks definitely were. Unfortunately, the 200-gallon metal tank was not ordered in any quantity. The paper tank, which wasn't that great, was ordered in small numbers. So few, in fact, that even though they were not that good, the USAAF still ran out of them. When I say it wasn't that good, I mean it's still a lot better than no drop tank at all. This was a whole bomber mafia debacle, and I want to stay on track, so I'm going to talk about the Republic tanks another time. Of course, Republic built the planes with racks to carry these drop tanks, starting with the first truly combat-ready model, the C-2RE, in September of 1942, and continuing through the early D models. These planes were in production well before Thunderbolts were in combat. Lack of capability to carry a drop tank was simply never an issue for Thunderbolt range. The problem was lack of a good drop tank. So General Kenny had Thunderbolts equipped to carry drop tanks, but no drop tanks. He did what you would expect. He wired Hap Arnold, the head of the USAAF, and asked for drop tanks to be sent immediately, by air if possible. Hap Arnold responded by sending him only 2 drop tanks, not 2 types, 2 tanks, both of which couldn't be attached to the Thunderbolt without significant modification, and they only held 110 gallons, which was fine for a P-39 or a P-40, but way too small for a Pacific Theater Thunderbolt, and really for any Thunderbolt. In fact, it appears from this page in the book Kirby's Thunderbolts that these tanks were literally P-39 or P-40 drop tanks, which makes sense. That explains why they wouldn't attach. In any case, they were not Thunderbolt drop tanks. At this point, General Kenny seemed to understand that help with drop tanks would not be coming through official channels, so he went over to the 27th Repair Squadron, told the mechanics and machinists there what he wanted, and within 2 days, they had a suitable 200-gallon drop tank for the Thunderbolt. Of course, the 27th couldn't mass produce them, so for that, they farmed the work out to Ford of Australia. I don't have an exact date for when the first batch of tanks produced by Ford of Australia was ready, but it appears to have been around the first week, maybe the second week of August 1943. In other words, they designed, built, and tested the first tank in 2 days, and about 6 weeks later, those tanks were coming off an assembly line and from an automotive company who had never built drop tanks before. This shows that when desired, drop tanks for the Thunderbolt could be designed and mass-produced in very little time. There is no excuse for the nearly year-long delay P-47s had getting drop tanks in other theaters, especially considering Hap Arnold had the entire U.S. aviation industry and a large part of the U.S. automotive industry at his beck and call. In fact, the median time to build an entire Liberty ship in 1943 was 39 days. How people can argue that putting a drop tank on a Thunderbolt was some sort of insurmountable problem for the USAAF is simply beyond me, especially when General Kenny did it without access to U.S. industry in about 6 weeks. The bottom line is that the Thunderbolts in Europe lacked a decent drop tank because of choices made by the bomber mafia, not due to any technical limitation. Now, there seems to be a huge misconception out there that because the early Thunderbolts, as used by the 5th Air Force in 1943, were not built with provisions to pressurize drop tanks, that those tanks were not usable at high altitude. I hear this all the time, the incorrect idea that if a tank isn't pressurized, you can't use it above 20,000 feet. As the early P-47s didn't have provisions to pressurize a drop tank, this is often given as a reason, usually the reason, that good drop tanks were not available for the Thunderbolt in the European theater. First of all, the idea that a drop tank has to be pressurized to work above 20,000 feet is absolutely false, so we need to talk about this. The biggest problem when feeding from a drop tank, not the only problem, but the biggest problem, is that at high altitudes the fuel boils off fast. Boiling off is much like evaporation, but faster. The boiling point is hugely affected by atmospheric pressure, which of course decreases with altitude. Thus, the higher the altitude, the more rapidly the fuel boils off and the bigger the problem. The reason boil off is an issue is because the fuel will then form vapors which will get in the line between the tank and the aircraft's fuel pump. That causes the pump to vapor lock. This problem gets magnified the higher the pump is relative to the tank. This caused what's commonly referred to as the Thunderbolt drop tank's 20,000 foot limitation. I think that number And that reference comes from Francis Gabreski's book, in which he talks about an early unpressurized drop tank for the Thunderbolt. And he correctly puts that limitation at 20,000 feet. I think people read more into this than what Gabreski actually said. What he says here is true, but he wasn't trying to write an all-encompassing explanation about how drop tank altitude limits work. He was just commenting on what he had on his plane at a specific point in time. What I think people are missing here is that there are a lot of other ways to solve this problem. Pressurizing the tanks is one way to solve it, and it's a good way, but it's not the only way or even the most common way. Pressurizing the tanks was originally called supercharging the tank. First, because it literally is supercharging the tank. Second, because the tanks were often pressurized by tapping pressure off of the engine supercharger, which is exactly how the Germans usually did it. Normally, drop tanks were pressurized to about 6 psi above ambient. This diagram is for a German FW-190A5 or A6. It shows that the drop tank is pressurized through a line coming from the aircraft's engine supercharger at position 23, the line at position 23. The valves at 24 and 25 are there to regulate pressure and prevent reverse flow. To our friends who can read German, let me know in the comments if I have that right. I'm pretty sure I do. Tank pressurization is great, but do the tanks have to be pressurized? Do you think they're pressurizing the fuel tanks in this DC-10 to 6 psi? Now, of course, I know it's powered by jet engines and it doesn't have drop tanks, but that number 2 engine is far higher relative to the fuel tanks, which are in the wings, than they are in any World War II fighter with drop tanks. Usually, designers of airliners solve this particular issue by putting the pumps in the fuel tanks, sometimes below. Back to the Thunderbolt, the easiest and cheapest way of dealing with all of this was to pressurize the drop tank, but that was specifically forbidden by the U.S. Army Air Force, as you can see in this document. I'll cover this and other barriers to drop tank development in another video, and these were regulatory hurdles and barriers, not technical ones. The point is that although it would have been very easy for Republic to do this on the assembly line or to retrofit, Republic didn't equip the Thunderbolt with a way to pressurize a drop tank because they were not allowed to by the USAAF leadership. Being aware of this and trying to solve the problem, yet still operating within the ever-changing myriad of rules on drop tanks, Republic went the extra mile to find a way around the USAAF leadership's poor decisions and came up with an alternative. Instead of pressurizing the tank, they offered more powerful fuel pump options. The more powerful pump options allowed for the use of an unpressurized drop tank up to 35,000 feet. Here are the altitude limitations for unpressurized drop tanks on a Thunderbolt with a normal G9 fuel pump. And we're talking about a belly drop tank here. You should notice 2 things. First, the altitude is somewhat dependent on power. The lower the power required, the higher the altitude limitation. For example, in the case of a belly tank, the pump can provide enough fuel for 42 inches of manifold pressure and 2550 RPM up to 17,250 feet. The 20,000 foot number we read in Francis Gabreski's book was for an unpressurized tank, and it's actually a cruise power setting, which is shown here to be 19,900 feet. The other thing you should notice is that the wing-mounted drop tanks are usable to higher altitudes. That's because tanks themselves are higher relative to the pump due to the wing's dihedral. Of course, Republic knew all of this. It wasn't a surprise to them. It's just basic physics. And they knew it would be desirable to go higher with drop tanks, so they offered other fuel pumps for the job. This is part of the same document. Here it shows the fuel pump options for P-47 drop tanks. It lists their altitude limits at military power. That's 42 inches of manifold pressure and 2550 RPM. This shows that the max altitude with the standard G9 pump is 17,000 feet. They offered a G10 pump, which allowed military power at 22,000 feet, 5,000 feet higher. From that, we can surmise it could have run at a pretty high cruise power setting at 27,000 feet. They also offered the K1 pump, which could run at military power all the way up to 35,000 feet. It should be extremely clear that the lack of tank pressurization in the early Thunderbolts is not at all altitude limiting and certainly not a valid excuse for not having drop tanks on the plane. While the document showing the test results of these planes is from July of 1943, I think it's likely that these pumps were available much earlier. Back over to the Pacific Theater, General Kenny's drop tank was ready for use, and the Thunderbolts came from the factory with a good rack to mount them. This picture shows a 5th Air Force Thunderbolt with the Brisbane drop tank. The Brisbane tank was not pressurized. It did not need to be because of the fuel pump changes. Sadly, I can't tell you exactly what they did with the fuel pumps. One problem with researching drop tanks is that people at the time didn't write down a lot about them. But in the book Kirby's Thunderbolts, it talks about some sort of fuel pump modification. I don't know if this was an additional G9 pump, a K1 pump, or what. Here is what I do have. This document is interesting for several reasons. First, General Kenny's tank, which I'm calling the Brisbane tank, used Republic's mounting system. We know that. Therefore, it did not require some later type of rack. However, back in the United States, Republic was being forced to switch over to the newer standardized B7 rack on the Thunderbolt's belly, but that wouldn't work with the Brisbane tank. Thus, as shown here, Republic had to keep the older mount in production specifically for 5th Air Force P-47s at least until October of 1943, and they did just that. This document also gives us a clue as to the fuel pump solution. It clearly states they did not use tank pressurization. That's important to note, but that they needed an additional G9 fuel pump. But Republic was unclear about where the 5th Air Force was mounting that pump, and considered just including them loose with the airplanes. This indicates to me that they were running a second or a relocated G9 pump, maybe somehow lower or closer to the tank, but I can't be sure. I also have this excerpt from an August 7th, 1943 letter from General Kenny that gives us a lot of really important information on the 5th Air Force Thunderbolts. First, he talks about the tail wheels only lasting 4 or 5 landings, thus he was in need of a lot of tail wheels. My guess is that the Republic tail wheel wasn't compatible with Marston matting, which was commonly used for U.S. runway construction in the Pacific. They must have resolved this quickly because I've only seen this issue referenced one other time. He then says that without drop tanks, his Thunderbolts wouldn't have enough range to go to the Markham Valley. For reference, the Markham Valley was where the action was at this point in our story. It's about 230 miles from Port Moresby. For comparison, the 8th Air Force in Europe initially considered 175 miles to be the maximum combat radius of the P-47 without a drop tank. After about a month to get familiar with the area, they expanded that to 230 miles. This shows that the combat radius of the Thunderbolt without drop tanks was about the same in either theater. Back to our letter. General Kenny then says he was getting impatient waiting for drop tanks to come through official channels and made his own, which we of course know as the Brisbane tank. Note that it's often called a 200-gallon tank, but it actually held 220 gallons. It was normal for drop tank sizes to be somewhat nominal. He then describes the fuel pressure with the drop tank, the speeds reached, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that it was good to 35,000 feet. This should put to bed any of this nonsense about it being impossible to use a P-47 drop tank without pressurization above 20,000 feet. Even if the lack of tank pressurization wasn't the fault of the U.S. Army Air Force leadership, which it was, there was still a workaround which Republic developed, and another workaround which the U.S. mechanics in Australia developed independently. The letter then talks about a turbocharger bearing problem. I think that was solved because I never heard about it again. I suspect this was simply because the pilots were not used to hearing a turbocharger mounted in the fuselage spinning fast at high altitudes. I'm not sure, but again, this problem was never mentioned again. The letter closes out saying that General Kenny was enthusiastic about the P-47. He was one of the few people in the Pacific at the time who felt that enthusiasm. The Thunderbolt just didn't look like a typical fighter. Over in Europe, pilots were quite disappointed when they first saw the plane and wanted to keep their Spitfires. However, it wasn't long before the European theater pilots were sold on the big plane, and I never heard of any of them asking to switch back. In the Pacific, it was much the same way, except that pilots wanted P-38 Lightnings. To deal with this morale issue, General Kenny had Neil Kirby, the commander of the 348th Fighter Group, fly in a mock dogfight against the commander of a P-38 squadron. The Thunderbolt prevailed. Kirby then flew in a mock dogfight against Dick Bong, a leading U.S. ace and the man who would eventually become the all-time U.S. ace of aces. Apparently, they called that one a draw. The big plane could fight. Of course, once the pilots started flying it, they really learned what it could do and how to use it. Yes, the Thunderbolt is huge, but she's a whole lot of rosy. So what about range? When equipped with the Brisbane Tank, how much range did the Thunderbolt have? Let's do some quick range calculations. Now, I do have a Pacific Theater manual for the Thunderbolt. It's a good manual, and it's just been added to the Patreon section in PDF format, link in description. But unfortunately, it's from June of 1944. By that point, they had introduced newer Thunderbolts with wing racks to carry P-38 style drop tanks and newer design belly racks. The Brisbane Tank is mostly a 1943 thing. They were still using them in 1944, but they slowly faded away once the newer tanks started being phased in. In fact, today there are only 2 known Brisbane tanks in existence. This is one of them. So we have to use Republic's January 1942 manual, which does have range data with a 200-gallon Republic tank. As that's the best we can do, I'll have to go with it. Bear with me, as range numbers are highly contentious, so I want to be thorough here. If you don't want to go through all this math, just skip ahead. That's perfectly fine. First, we need to know how much fuel are we going to use during engine start, warm-up, taxi, takeoff, and forming up. We have good data on that from Colonel Howe, who did a lot of the range testing in England with the 8th Air Force. He started up, taxied, took off on the main fuel tank, and then switched over to the drop tank at about 1,000 feet, which makes sense. Then burned fuel out of the 75-gallon drop tank, which actually held 83 gallons. Burned that fuel until that drop tank was empty, at which point the plane was at 27,500 feet and had traveled 161 miles. His estimate, based on his testing, was that the 75-gallon tank would get a Thunderbolt up to 25,000 feet and 140 to 150 miles from base, including forming up after takeoff. So that's a pretty good number. I'll use 140 miles here. I realize this isn't a 200-gallon tank, but it's the best we have, and it's probably very close. Of course, some fuel was used from the main internal tank during ground operations, takeoff, and the climb to 1,000 feet. So we need to know how much internal fuel is on board when the external tank is dropped. The rates of fuel consumption for the R2800 are rock solid, straight from the pilot's manual. Using maximum power for takeoff, we will burn fuel at a rate of 275 gallons per hour up to 1,000 feet when we'll pull power back for the climb. That's going to take less than 1 minute, which I'll round up to 5 gallons of gasoline. I'm rounding everything up or down. In other words, I'm not using advantageous numbers in these calculations. The pilot's manual does not give rate of fuel consumption for ground operations, but rather it groups engine, startup, warm-up, takeoff, and climb to an unspecified altitude together, pegs it at 45 gallons. Doesn't matter much for our work today, but that unspecified altitude is right about 15,000 feet. Based on my own experience with aircraft engines, the ground operations will take about 15 gallons at most. I also tested this in Digital Combat Simulator, which is very accurate and certainly accurate in regards to fuel flow rates. And I find the numbers are usually closer to 10 gallons, maybe 12. Now, I know that it's only a simulator, but of course I don't have a real Thunderbolt, so it's the best I could do. For this test, I used missions from reflected simulations, which factor in everything from the actual bases the 56th Fighter Group used in England. That means starting, warm-up, the taxi out, taking off in pairs, everything. And it's usually less than 20 gallons to get to 1,000 feet. All right, so at this point, we've traveled 140 miles and we have 137 gallons left in our 220-gallon drop tank. How far can we go on that? For that, we go to this chart from the manual. Our total fuel on board at this point is about 422 gallons. That's 137 gallons in the drop tank, 285 internally. Remember, we use 20 gallons of internal fuel before switching to the drop tank. From this chart, the closest we have is 425 gallons, which is close enough, and on that we can go 1,140 miles. We divide 1140 by 425 to get miles per gallon, because that's an easy thing to work with, and we get 2.68 miles per gallon for a Thunderbolt in this configuration with this fuel load. Multiply that by 137, the number of gallons left in the drop tank, to find out how much farther we can go on drop tank fuel, and we get 367 miles. Add that to our 140 for a total distance with no wind, but including warm-up, taxi, takeoff, forming up, and climbing out, of 507 miles, at which point we drop the tank and operate on internal fuel. Note that we could go farther if we could accept a lower altitude. However, I use numbers good up to 30,000 feet to keep this realistic. Over New Guinea, P-47s typically cruised between 24,000 feet and 28,000 feet, much like in the European theater. There was a mountain range between the main U.S. base at Port Moresby and the Japanese positions, and the peaks were all around 15,000 feet high. Also, the Japanese Army was flying Kawasaki Ki-61 Tonys. I have a video about that airplane, but just know that in 1943 it was quite threatening to U.S. fighters. It could outturn any U.S. fighter, and it had a top speed at lower altitudes about equal to a 1943 Thunderbolt, with very similar dive performance. In fact, in all the reports I've read from combat Thunderbolt pilots, the Tony is the only prop-driven plane that is ever mentioned as having dive performance equal to a Thunderbolt. Below 15,000 feet, the Thunderbolts did not have any real advantages over the Ki-61 Tonys, so the Thunderbolts tended to stay up high where they did have an edge. Keep in mind, we're talking about Thunderbolts with toothpick props and no water injection, not the later versions of the Thunderbolt, which were much more formidable. Before we go farther, I need to explain the red numbers on this chart. I know that there are people that will incorrectly claim that this chart somehow shows that the Republic drop tank couldn't go to 30,000 feet. It certainly could if set up with the right fuel pumps. That's why the data is on this chart. The note at the bottom states that the numbers in red are subject to revision after flight check. Thinking about that logically, it also means that the numbers in black are not. What's subject to revision are the range, speed, and power numbers, the stuff in red. That doesn't mean those numbers are wrong. It means that either they are just numbers from Republic that haven't been verified by the USAAF or are based on calculations. Range numbers are always on the side of caution in aviation. Otherwise, when on long-range missions, fuel exhaustion accidents would be the norm rather than the exception. Now, there were fuel exhaustion accidents. 24 P-51 Mustangs were lost in one day due to fuel exhaustion. That wasn't because they couldn't meet their published range numbers. It was because they got lost and couldn't find their island. Thus, the pilots had to bail out or ditch. These same sorts of things happened to Thunderbolts and probably every other type of fighter in the Pacific theater. Also, red numbers were the norm, not just for the Thunderbolt, because numbers were being revised all the time. For example, here's a chart for the P-51B. They are all red as well. Here is the takeoff performance chart for the P-51B. Same thing. That doesn't mean you can't take off. It doesn't mean these numbers are not at least in the ballpark. Again, they're probably on the side of caution. We don't have a later chart for the Thunderbolt Razorback with a 200-gallon tank. At least I have never seen one. But these numbers do align with everything we do have. Furthermore, there is a chart from the same manual without a drop tank, and those numbers are also in red, but they are identical, and I mean identical, to those from the November manual, which has those in black. Thus, of the red numbers that were verified and that we can check, literally none changed. Back to our mission. We left off after flying 507 miles. We dropped our external tank. If you remember correctly, we had to go 367 miles on drop tank fuel. At 200 miles per hour indicated, that's 206.5 calibrated, that gives us 304 miles per hour of true airspeed. So that 367 miles will take us about an hour and 12 minutes, plus about 33 minutes for the climb, and it's an hour and 45 minutes. Now, all that time, the Thunderbolt's vapor return line was putting fuel back into the main tank. It does this at a rate as high as 10 gallons per hour, less at higher power settings. In our scenario, I'm going to guess it's around 7 gallons per hour, which means it will have returned about 12 gallons into the main tank. Thus, we will have about 297 gallons on board when we drop the external tank. Not quite the full internal of 305, but pretty close. Combat radius is determined by internal fuel in this case and in a lot of cases. So the question now is, After 20 minutes of combat, and with keeping 30 minutes of reserve fuel, which were the normal numbers for mission planning in 1943, how far can we go? We have a chart for that. I'll put up the color version here initially to satisfy the red number mafia, and I already explained why I'm so confident that these red numbers in terms of range are correct. Furthermore, as you'll see later, the numbers off this chart line up with all sorts of official USAAF data. I'm going to switch back to the black and white chart because it's a little bit sharper. 20 minutes of combat will use no more than 76 gallons in this version of the Thunderbolt. That's 5 minutes at emergency power, 15 minutes at max continuous. Reserve fuel is normally calculated at the rate of minimum fuel consumption, but I'm going to use 70 gallons an hour here, so we need to add 35 gallons to that 76 we're going to use in combat. That leaves us 186 gallons to get home after combat and with a good 30-minute reserve at an altitude above most of the mountains in the theater. Back to our chart. And we don't have a column for 186 gallons. We could do the math, but instead let's just use the 175 gallon column. And that gives us a range of 486 miles. So ultimately, that's about the maximum combat radius of a P-47 Thunderbolt with 305 gallons of internal fuel. Now, it could be stretched out a bit. We could factor in that 11 gallons that I left out. We could probably cruise back at a lower altitude in a lot of cases. And later in the war, manual leaning was employed, so we could, in theory, get quite a bit more range with that. But I'm dealing with the theater and time period reality here. We do have to avoid those key 61s and in some cases get over the mountains. So far, our calculations show 507 miles outbound with a 220-gallon drop tank, with the ability to fly 486 miles back to base on internal fuel. However, these two numbers, the 507 and the 486, are actually closer together because that 12 gallons that went from the drop tank into the main tank wasn't deducted from the 507-mile number. We need to do that now. 12 gallons, 2.68 miles per gallon, that's about 33 miles. Subtract that from 507 and we have an outbound range of 474 miles with the ability to fly 486 miles back to base, allowing for combat and reserves. That works out to a combat radius for a Thunderbolt so equipped of 480 miles. So how does our calculation compare with official data? I would say quite well. With dual 108-gallon drop tanks, so about the same amount of fuel as a Brisbane tank, slightly less, the official combat radius for an escorting Razorback Thunderbolt is 475 miles. That number is from the 8th Air Force Tactical Summary, a source not exactly friendly to Thunderbolt range, and that 475-mile number is in there twice for this configuration. I think that validates our calculation. With wing pylons, the Thunderbolt could carry other drop tanks, dual 150-gallon tanks, for example. Although these obviously have more fuel than the 108s, they don't increase the plane's combat radius. It's still 475 miles. That makes sense because, again, combat radius is limited in all of these cases by internal fuel. It won't matter if we have a single 220-gallon belly tank, dual 108s, or even dual 150s or 165s. They all have the same limitations in terms of range getting home once the tanks are dropped. The U.S. Army Air Force Final Report, that's what it's called, Final Report, on aircraft range gives a number of 450 miles. Their range number is slightly lower than ours because they're cruising back to base at 35 inches of manifold pressure. We use 31 inches. Thus, we are on rock-solid ground standing on a 450-mile combat radius with the Brisbane belly tank. I'll also mention that Chris Fahey, a modern-day warbird pilot who flies the P-38 and a lot of other cool stuff, commented in the chat of a recent debate on Thunderbolt range, and he said that combat radius for this airplane is 450 miles once the tanks are dropped and is ultimately limited by internal fuel. Not that Chris Fahey is an official U.S. Army Air Force source, I'm not saying that, but his opinion on range certainly has at least some weight. Let's summarize this video at this point. I think I busted a lot of myths in this video. Tank pressurization is a big one. This comes up all the time. So I've shown two documents, one from Boylan and one from the U.S. Army Air Force, demonstrating that it was the U.S. AAF, not Republic, that was responsible for the lack of pressurization in drop tanks. Not only that, I have shown that Republic offered a workaround for the lack of tank pressurization, that lack of tank pressurization having been forced upon them. And I showed evidence from the U.S. Army Air Force testing that going to 27,000 feet or even 35,000 feet on an unpressurized drop tank was not a problem with Republic's workaround in place. Furthermore, I showed that in actual practice, the Brisbane tank, which was not pressurized, was going to 28,000 feet via the 5th Air Force fuel mod. Therefore, all of this big talk about a lack of tank pressurization being the reason Thunderbolts couldn't escort into Germany is a bunch of nonsense from people that either don't know the history, understand the technical issue, or possibly both. I think the most important myth busted here is the idea that it was somehow impossible or very difficult to put a good 200-gallon drop tank onto a Thunderbolt in early 1943. It wasn't. And the proof of this is that as soon as General Kenny received his Thunderbolts, he had a good 220-gallon tank designed and into production in about 6 weeks, with relatively limited resources to make that happen. He was putting those tanks on Thunderbolts that had factory drop tank mounts that had been on every production Thunderbolt built from about September of 1942, actually I think earlier. There was absolutely no reason this could not have been done in the United States much earlier for the planes that were headed to the European theater. Perhaps most importantly, I showed via not only the math, but two separate U.S. Army Air Force sources that a Razorback Thunderbolt with 220 gallons or thereabouts of drop tank fuel had an honest 450-mile combat radius. In fact, the escort radius is listed as 475 miles in one of those two documents, which almost exactly lines up with our mathematical calculations using numbers from the Republic Manual, which also serves to show that the range charts in the January of 1943 Thunderbolt Manual are in harmony with later data, red numbers or not. That 450-mile and certainly the 475-mile number give the Thunderbolt enough range to escort to nearly all the targets the U.S. Army Air Force hit in Germany in 1943, specifically and probably most importantly Schweinfurt, which matters because the reason most often given for the huge losses of U.S. bombers on the Schweinfurt raids is the Thunderbolt's so-called lack of range. It was actually a lack of drop tanks, an easily solvable issue which was proven by General Kenny and the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. It's worth noting that General Kenny's Brisbane tanks were eventually emulated in the European theater with this 215-gallon centerline tank. In some cases, meaning when more fuel wasn't needed, this was preferable to the wing tanks because once dropped, that beautiful Seversky wing isn't cluttered by performance-robbing pylons. I have a lot more I can say on drop tanks, especially about all the roadblocks put up by the bomber mafia to hinder drop tank development and implementation. However, I think that's enough drop tank information for now. In the next video, I'm going to cover actual missions flown in the Pacific to show just how far Thunderbolts flew operationally, and I'll compare and contrast that with European theater missions. I think this will be very eye-opening for a lot of people. Please like and subscribe and consider joining my Patreon. On Patreon, you will find that Pacific Theater P-47 manual, as well as General Kenny's book and many other aircraft manuals and historical books and documents. In fact, just about everything I have used to create the videos on this channel can be found there. Plus, I answer questions there, I have polls, and Patreon members get early access to videos and can see them ad-free during that early access period. Now, there's just one more thing I want to talk about. People keep asking me about the increased internal fuel mod done to the 305-gallon Razorback Thunderbolts in the Pacific. That means the Razorback Thunderbolts that only hold 305 gallons internally, which is pretty much all of them. There was such a mod, that did exist. It involved a 42-gallon self-sealing tank, more or less located behind the pilot's seat, just aft of the armor plate. I have very little information on this mod. In fact, I only learned about it when reading a website page about the restoration of a Thunderbolt wreckage, which is now a beautiful flying airplane called Bonnie. You can look it up. It's a fantastic example of a restored Republic Razorback Thunderbolt. It appears that this mod was done on a very small number of airplanes and for a very limited time. As I've mentioned before, the Thunderbolt wasn't the easiest to fly or the most stable fighter in the first place, and putting a tank aft of the cockpit would have moved the center of gravity farther aft, making it more difficult to fly. Now, I'm not saying the Thunderbolt was terribly difficult to fly. It does a lot of good things going for it. Good ailerons, wide track landing gear, but it's not easy. Now, I read that General Kenny felt that for some reason, this additional self-sealing fuel tank presented an increased fire hazard, and so he put a stop to the mod. I don't know if that's true or not. However, consider this. His book has quite a bit of space devoted to the Brisbane Tank, so we know that he felt that was important. Yet the internal 42-gallon tank mod isn't even mentioned in his book. That tells me that the internal tank was not significant to him. On the site Pacific Rex, they have a list of all Thunderbolts lost in the South Pacific. Well, the Southwest Pacific anyway. The people that run this site are hardcore. They comb through the jungles of New Guinea looking for wreckages. Of all the Thunderbolts they have found, only 2 of them had this internal tank field mod. Both of them were D-23s, and they were consecutive serial number airplanes. That tells me a few things. First, the D-23 was the last of the Razorbacks, so this mod, even if it didn't create a fire hazard, would have been made obsolete soon after by the bubble tops that were starting to show up. Thus, it would have been a short-lived mod, even if it did work really well, which I sort of doubt. The fact that we only know of 2 airplanes that had this mod, and the fact that they're consecutive serial number airframes, also points to a mod done for a very short period of time and in very limited numbers. It's also not mentioned in any of the books I have read about the Pacific Theater Thunderbolts, not that there are a lot of those books. In short, I think it was something that was experimental and not even used at the squadron level, just on a handful of airplanes. But I could be wrong, and I'll let you guys know all about that if I discover any more. Okay, that really is it. I'll see you in the next video, which will cover Thunderbolt missions in the Pacific. Goodbye, and have a great day.